On September 14, 1991, a 52-year-old farmer named Warren Duluth stood in the sales lot of Bridger Implement in Richland Center, Wisconsin, looking at two Case IH tractors parked side by side. The first was a 1988 Case IH 7140 Magnum with 1,200 hours on it, priced at $68,500. The second was a 1986 Case IH 7120 with 2,890 hours, priced at $41,000. Warren farmed 640 acres of corn and soybeans. His current tractor, a 1978 Case IH 2390, had finally given out after 13 years. The transmission had failed in August during the final weeks of summer fieldwork, and the repair estimate had come back at $9,400. Warren had decided to replace it rather than rebuild it. He'd saved $38,000 over 3 years, specifically for this purpose, and he had $12,000 in available credit if he needed it. The salesman, a man named Phil Osterman, who had been selling Case IH equipment in Richland County since 1979, stood beside Warren and explained the difference between the two machines. The 7140 had 20 more horsepower, 175 versus 155. It had a newer transmission design, better hydraulics, and lower hours. It was the right tractor for 640 acres. The 7120, Phil said, was adequate for smaller operations, but Warren would be pushing it. He'd have to run slower, use lighter implements, work longer hours to cover the same ground. Warren asked how much longer. Phil said maybe 15% more time in the field, maybe 20%, depending on conditions. Warren looked at the price tags. The 7140 would require him to finance $30,500 over 5 years at 8.2% interest. The monthly payment would be $621. The 7120 he could buy outright with $3,000 left over. He asked Phil which one he'd buy. Phil said the 7140 without question. Warren bought the 7120 that afternoon and drove it home. If you've been farming long enough to remember when a tractor was a 20-year commitment, when horsepower was something you grew into rather than bought ahead of need, and when the decision between adequate and ideal could shape everything that followed, then you understand this story isn't about machinery specifications. It's about the space between what works and what's recommended, and what gets built or lost in that space across 30 years. We're telling these stories because they document decisions that only reveal themselves across decades. Because farming is measured in seasons, but consequences are measured in lifetimes. If that kind of slow accounting matters to you, consider subscribing. These stories take time to research and tell with the accuracy they deserve. Now back to September 1991, and a farmer driving home in a tractor everyone said was too small. Warren Duluth had been farming the same 640 acres outside Lone Rock, Wisconsin since 1967, when he'd taken over the operation from his father at age 28. The land had been in the family since 1923. Warren's grandfather had cleared 280 of those acres by hand, pulling stumps with horses and dynamite. Warren's father had added another 360 through careful purchases during the Depression when neighbors couldn't make payments. Warren inherited the farm debt-free, and he'd kept it that way for 24 years, through an operational philosophy his father had taught him, and his father's father had taught before that, which was that you buy what you can afford to own outright. You maintain what you buy until it cannot be maintained anymore. And you never confuse capacity with necessity. The 1978 Case IH 2390 Warren had run 13 years, had been purchased used with 890 hours on it for $32,000 in 1978. Warren had paid cash. The tractor had 11,200 hours on it when the transmission failed in August 1991. Warren had changed the oil every 100 hours, greased every fitting, replaced filters on schedule, and repaired what broke when it broke. The transmission failure was not neglect. It was age. And when the mechanic at Bridger Implement gave Warren the $9,400 estimate, Warren thanked him, took the paperwork home, and made the decision he'd been preparing to make for 3 years, which was to replace the tractor entirely. Warren's wife, Judith, had been keeping the farm's books since 1969. She understood the numbers better than Warren did, and when he told her he was buying the 7120 instead of the 7140, she asked him to explain the logic. Warren said the logic was that he could afford the 7120 without debt and could not afford the 7140 without it. Judith said the 7140 would save time. Warren said time was not the constraint. Money was. Judith asked what Phil Osterman had recommended. Warren said Phil recommended the 7140. Judith asked why Warren was ignoring that recommendation. Warren said because Phil's job was to sell tractors, and Warren's job was to pay for them. Judith looked at him across the kitchen table and said she trusted his judgment, but wanted him to be certain, because 30 years was a long time to regret saving money in September. Warren said he was certain. The 7120 arrived at the farm on September 16, 1991. Warren spent the first week learning its rhythms, its response, the way it pulled under load. The tractor felt lighter than the 2390, more responsive in some ways, less forgiving in others. The rated horsepower was 155 at the PTO, 20 less than the 7140, and Warren could feel the difference when he hooked up his 12-row planter in the spring of 1992. The planter was a white 6100, built in 1984, designed to be pulled by a tractor with 160 to 180 horsepower. The 7120 pulled it, but not comfortably. Warren had to run in a lower gear than he'd used with the 2390. His ground speed dropped from 5.2 miles per hour to 4.4. What had taken him 11 days to plant in 1991 took him 13 days in 1992. The weather held, and the delay didn't cost him yield, but Warren felt the time. He felt it in the longer days, the extra hours in the seat, the slower pace. At the co-op in May, a neighboring farmer named Ed Kleinsasser asked Warren how the new tractor was working out. Warren said it was working fine. Ed said he'd heard Warren bought the 7120 instead of the 7140. Warren said that was correct. Ed said that seemed like an odd choice for 640 acres. Warren said it was the choice that fit his budget. Ed said, "But you're running slower now, aren't you?" Warren said he was. Ed said, "So you're losing time." Warren said he wasn't losing time. He was spending more of it. Ed looked at him and said, "That's the same thing." Warren said, "No, it's not." And he drove home and didn't explain what he meant. He meant, because the explanation required a kind of accounting, a clamfess. Ed Kleinsasser didn't use, which was the accounting that measured not just time spent in the field, but money not owed to a bank. By the end of 1992, Warren had calculated that the 7120 had cost him approximately 190 additional hours in the seat compared to what the 7140 would have required. But the 7140 would have cost him $7,446 in loan payments and interest. Warren made $0 per hour for his own labor, because farm labor is not hourly, and the 190 hours had come from his own time, which was a cost he could absorb. The $7,446 would have come from revenue he did not have margin to spare. In 1993, grain prices dropped. Corn went from $2.45 a bushel to $2.18. Soybeans fell from $5.80 to $5.35. Warren's revenue dropped by $14,000. His costs remained the same. If he'd been carrying debt on the 7140, the margin would have disappeared entirely. As it was, he broke even. Judith asked him in December if he still thought the 7120 was the right choice. Warren said yes. Judith said, "You're working harder." Warren said, "I'm working the same. I'm just doing it slower." Judith said, "Is that sustainable?" Warren said, "We're still here." That became the test. Not whether the work was easier, but whether they were still farming. The 7120 ran through the 1990s the way Warren ran the farm, steadily and without drama. He used it for plowing, planting, pulling wagons during harvest. He changed the oil every 100 hours. He replaced the clutch in 1995 at 6,200 hours. He rebuilt the hydraulic pump in 1998. These were expected repairs, normal wear. The engine never failed. In 1997, Ed Kleinsasser traded his 1989 Case IH 7130 for a new 7230 Magnum with a cab, GPS guidance, and 200 horsepower. The new tractor cost $118,000. Ed financed it over 7 years. He told Warren the technology was transformative, that the GPS alone saved him 8% on seed and chemical costs by reducing overlap. Warren congratulated him and went back to farming with the 7120. No cab, no GPS, just a tractor that started every morning and pulled what he asked it to pull. By 2000, the 7120 had 9,800 hours on it. Warren had spent $11,400 on maintenance and repairs over 9 years, an average of $1,267 per year. The tractor had no book value anymore. It was fully depreciated, but it ran. In 2002, Warren turned 63. His son, Nathan, who had left the farm in 1985 to work as an electrician in Madison, came home for Thanksgiving and asked his father when he planned to retire. Warren said he hadn't thought about it. Nathan said the farm wasn't making money. Warren said it was making enough. Nathan said enough for what? Warren said enough to keep farming. Nathan looked at his father and said, "You're 63 years old, running equipment from the 1980s, working 70-hour weeks during planting and harvest. For what? To break even?" Warren didn't answer. Nathan said, "I'm not coming back to farm, Dad. You know that." Warren said, "I know." Nathan said, "So what's the plan?" Warren said, "The plan is to keep going until I can't." Nathan left the next day. He didn't come back for 2 years. The drought of 2005 hit Wisconsin hard. June, July, and August brought almost no rain. Warren's corn withered in the field. His soybean yields dropped by 40%. He combined in September and stored what little grain he had, waiting for prices to improve. They didn't. His revenue that year was $87,000. His costs were $72,000. He cleared $15,000, barely enough to cover property taxes and insurance. If he'd been carrying debt on a tractor, he would have gone negative. As it was, he survived. The 7120 worked through the drought without complaint. The engine ran hot in the dry ground, but it ran. Warren pulled a 6-row cultivator instead of his usual 8-row to reduce load. His field work took longer, but the tractor handled it. In 2006, rain returned. Warren's yields recovered. He had a decent crop, decent prices, a decent year. He paid down some deferred maintenance, replaced worn tires, rebuilt the starter on the 7120. The tractor had 4,600 hours on it. It was 20 years old, and it was still the most reliable piece of equipment Warren owned. In 2008, the farm economy collapsed. Corn prices spiked briefly to $7 a bushel in June, then crashed to $3.20 by December. Credit markets froze. Equipment dealers stopped offering financing. Warren's neighbor, a man named Ron Vickers, who farmed 1,100 acres, had purchased a new Case IH Magnum 305 in 2007 for $167,000, financed over 7 years. When corn prices collapsed, Ron couldn't make his payments. The bank foreclosed in March 2009. Ron's equipment, his land, everything sold at auction in May. Warren attended the auction but didn't buy anything. He just watched. The Magnum 305 sold for $91,000, half what Ron had paid. The farm sold for $4,200 an acre, $800 below Ron's purchase price. Ron and his wife moved to town. Ron took a job at a feed mill. Warren drove home and parked the 7120 in the machine shed and stood there looking at it for a long time. This tractor, everyone had said, was too small, too old, too slow. And he thought about the $621 monthly payment he'd never made, the $44,712 in principal and interest he'd never owed, and the fact that he was still farming, and Ron Vickers was not. By 2010, Warren had been running the 7120 for 19 years. The tractor had 17,200 hours on it. He'd replaced the clutch twice, rebuilt the transmission once, overhauled the fuel injection pump, replaced the radiator, and installed a new seat. Total maintenance costs since 1991, $28,600. He'd also bought a used Case IH 2388 combine in 2003 for $48,000, paid cash. Between the tractor and the combine, Warren had spent $117,600 on equipment over 19 years with no debt. Ed Kleinsasser, who'd bought the 7230 Magnum in 1997, had traded it in 2005 for a Magnum 275, then traded that in 2010 for a Magnum 340. He'd been carrying equipment debt continuously since 1997. His total payments over those 13 years, including interest, exceeded $200,000. Ed's operation was larger, 920 acres, and his equipment was newer, faster, more capable. But his margin was thinner because his fixed costs were higher. Warren's operation was smaller and slower, but his costs were almost entirely variable. When grain prices dropped, Warren could adjust. Ed could not. In 2012, Judith was diagnosed with lung cancer. She'd never smoked, but the cancer was aggressive. She underwent surgery in Milwaukee, then chemotherapy through the winter. Warren drove her to every appointment, 4 hours round trip, twice a week. The farm work fell behind. He didn't plant until late May. He hired a neighbor's son to help with field work, paying him $12 an hour. Warren combined in October alone, running the 2388 from dawn until dark, stopping only when the grain was too wet or when exhaustion forced him to. Judith died on November 3, 2012. Warren buried her in the cemetery outside Lone Rock next to his parents. He returned to the farm and finished harvest because there was nothing else to do. The medical bills took 2 years to pay off. The 7120 ran through all of it. In 2015, Warren turned 76. Nathan came home for Christmas and asked his father again about retirement. Warren said he was thinking about it. Nathan said, "You've been thinking about it for 13 years. Warren said, "Thinking takes time." Nathan said, "Dad, you can't keep doing this. You're 76 years old." Warren said, "I'm still doing it, aren't I?" Nathan said, "For how long?" Warren didn't answer. Nathan asked what the farm was worth. Warren said the land was worth maybe $1.8 million at current prices. The equipment was worth maybe $30,000, maybe less. Nathan said, "So sell it, retire, move to town." Warren said, "And do what?" Nathan said, "Rest." Warren said, "I don't know how to rest." Nathan left the next day. He called once a month after that. The conversations were brief. In 2016, Warren listed the farm for sale. He was 77 years old. His knees hurt. His back was stiff every morning. He couldn't keep farming alone. The realtor put up a sign. A few people came to look. One was a young couple from Minnesota, mid-30s, looking to start farming. They walked the land, looked at the equipment, asked questions. The woman asked Warren how long he'd been farming. Warren said 49 years. She asked if he'd enjoyed it. Warren said enjoyment wasn't the word he'd use. She asked what word he would use. Warren said necessary. They didn't make an offer. In August, a man named Kyle Brenner called. He was 34 years old, farming with his father on 480 acres, 2 counties over. They wanted to expand. Kyle came to walk the land, to see the equipment. He spent 20 minutes in the machine shed looking at the 71120. "How many hours?" Kyle asked. 18,900, Warren said. "Does it still run?" Warren started it. The engine fired immediately, settled into a smooth idle. Kyle listened for a moment, then shut it off. "I'll buy the farm," Kyle said, "but I want the Case IH included." They agreed on a price, $1.82 million for the land, equipment, and buildings. The sale closed in November 2016. On the day Warren moved off the farm, he loaded his truck with tools, a few pieces of furniture, boxes of photographs. He was moving to a small house in Richland Center, a place with no land, no shed, no equipment. Kyle Brenner arrived in the afternoon to take possession. Warren handed him the keys to the house, the keys to the machinery. They stood in the driveway for a moment. "That's 7120, Warren said. "I've kept every maintenance record since 1991. They're in a binder in the office. You might want them." Kyle nodded. "I appreciate that." Warren climbed into his truck. He looked at the machine shed one last time, at the fields he'd worked for 49 years, at the house where Judith had died, where his father had died, where his grandfather had lived. Then he drove into town. He didn't look back. Kyle Brenner ran the 7120 for 3 more seasons. In 2017, he used it to pull a field cultivator and a grain cart. In 2018, he used it for light tillage and hauling. In 2019, the tractor reached 21,000 hours, and Kyle decided it had earned retirement. He parked it in the back of the shed and bought a newer Case IH Magnum 250, financed over 5 years. But he kept the 7120. He told his wife it ran too well to scrap. In the winter of 2018, Kyle was going through the office filing cabinet and found the binder Warren had mentioned. Inside were maintenance records dating back to September 16, 1991. Every oil change, every repair, every parts purchase, documented in Warren's precise handwriting. At the back of the binder was a separate section labeled Operating Costs Comparison. Kyle opened it. Inside was a spreadsheet Warren had maintained from 1991 through 2016. It listed every expense related to the 7 and 20: purchase price, fuel, oil, filters, repairs, tires, everything. The total came to $127,340 over 25 years. Below that was a second calculation labeled Estimated Cost, 7140 Alternative. Warren had projected what the 7140 would have cost. The original $68,500 purchase price, 5 years of loan payments at 8.2% interest totaling $37,260, higher fuel consumption, more expensive parts, and projected maintenance. The total came to $260,180. The difference was $88,840. Below that, in Warren's handwriting, was a note: additional hours in seat, 4,800. Additional debt payments avoided, 37,260. Net operational savings, 88,000 Cost per additional hour worked, 0. Value of remaining debt-free incalculable. Kyle sat in the office reading the spreadsheet for a long time. He thought about the 7120 sitting in the shed with 21,000 hours on it, still running. He thought about Warren Duluth, 77 years old, moving to town after 49 years of farming. He thought about the neighbors who'd told Warren the tractor was too small, the dealer who'd recommended the bigger machine, the years of slower field work, longer days, extra hours. And he thought about Ron Vickers, who'd bought the bigger tractor, the better tractor, the one everyone recommended, and who'd lost his farm when the economy collapsed because the payments didn't stop when the prices did. Kyle closed the binder and put it back in the filing cabinet. That evening, he told his wife what he'd found. She asked if Warren had been right to buy the smaller tractor. Kyle said Warren farmed for 49 years and walked away with the farm paid off and money in the bank. Ron Vickers farmed for 30 years and lost everything. She asked if that was an answer. Kyle said it's the only answer that matters. In 2021, Warren Duluth was living in his small house in Richland Center. He was 82 years old. He didn't farm anymore. He didn't work. He read, he walked, he sat on his porch in the evenings watching the sun set over land he no longer owned. In October, Kyle Brenner called him. "I wanted you to know," Kyle said. "I finally retired the 7120. It hit 21,400 hours. Transmission's starting to slip, not worth rebuilding at this point." Warren was quiet for a moment. "That's a good run," he said. "I found your records," Kyle said. "The binder, the cost comparison." "I figured you would," Warren said. "Did you calculate all of that while you were farming, or after?" "During," Warren said. "Every year. I wanted to know if I'd made the right choice." "And did you?" Kyle asked. Warren looked out his window at the street, at the small yard with no equipment, no fields. "I'm still here," he said. "That's how I know." They talked for a few more minutes, then hung up. Warren sat in his chair for a long time after the call ended. He thought about September 14th, 1991, the sales lot, the 2 tractors, Phil Osterman saying the 7140 was the right choice, Judith asking if he was certain, Ed Kleinsasser saying Warren was losing time, and Warren thought about the 4,800 additional hours he'd spent in the seat of the 7120 over 25 years. Hours that could have been avoided if he'd bought more horsepower, more capacity, more machine. But those hours had cost him nothing except time. And the time had bought him something Phil Osterman's sales pitch never mentioned, and Ed Kleinsasser's efficiency calculations never measured, which was the freedom to survive 2008 without debt, to bury his wife without losing the farm, to retire at 77 and walk away with the land sold and the bills paid and nothing owed to anyone. The Case IH 7120 that Warren Duluth bought in 1991 is still sitting in Kyle Brenner's machine shed. Kyle hasn't scrapped it. He tells people it's because the engine still runs, because 21,400 hours deserves respect, because equipment that old and that reliable shouldn't end up in a salvage yard. But the real reason, the one Kyle doesn't say out loud, is that the tractor represents something he's trying to learn, something Warren understood from the beginning, that the right machine isn't always the most powerful one, that efficiency isn't always measured in hours saved, and that sometimes the cost of going faster is everything you'll lose when you can't afford to slow down. Warren Duluth died in January 2023. He was 83 years old. The obituary in the Richland Center newspaper listed his survivors: his son Nathan, 2 grandchildren, a sister in Minnesota. It mentioned he had farmed in Richland County for nearly 5 decades. It did not mention the 7120. It did not mention the spreadsheet. It did not mention the 4,800 hours or the $88,840 or the choice he made in September 1991 that everyone said was too small. But Kyle Brenner knows, and the binder is still in the filing cabinet, and the 7120 is still in the shed. And someday, when someone asks Kyle why he kept a 37-year-old tractor with a slipping transmission and no book value, he'll tell them about a farmer who bought what he could afford instead of what he was told to buy, and who farmed for 49 years because of it, and who died debt-free. And that will be the only explanation that matters.